this episode of Action Hour, Marnie and I are going to discuss and have reflections on the Wildfire conference that we attended this past weekend, August 24th, organized by Whidbey Climate Action at the Whidbey Island Center for the Arts. And it was an all-day event with lots of really interesting speakers. And it's the first time that I've attended one of Whidbey Climate Action's events, so I was really excited to attend. But the topic was thinking about the unthinkable and kind of working through wildfire on Whidbey Island, whether or not, like how at risk we are, what we can do to prepare. And so what were you thinking, Marnie? Like what are your takeaways from that conference?
Yeah. I really went into the conference knowing that it would be a call to action. Mm-hmm. Part of what I was hoping to get was a sense of, can our community make a clear and compelling demand of jurisdictions and people in positions of power mm-hmm. to develop the resilience against wildfire that we need in order to be safer? Mm-hmm. And I think what I came out with was a sense of that urgency, but also a lot of comfort around the great solutions that are already out there. The people charged with public safety that are already doing thoughtful, well-informed work, mm-hmm. The resources that are already available to us as community members to mm-hmm. be more fire-wise and fire-ready. And so I was sort of expecting it to fire me up and make me say, we demand change. But I think what it actually did was it comforted me to know that a lot of the resources we need are already out there. Mm-hmm. I do still believe we need more rapid adoption of good solutions. Mm-hmm. There were a couple speakers that I found really particularly compelling. Everybody who spoke was great, but there were a couple of presentations where I just felt such a resounding sense of relief when I imagined a Whidbey Island and a Whidbey and Camano Island County where those solutions were being adopted, that it made me feel really excited and empowered. So much less, we demand change, and much more, change is here. Let's work with it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I thought there were quite a few things that I thought were really interesting. The first speaker, I missed the keynote speaker at the beginning of the conference because my car battery died and I had to jump my car. And so I came in with the presenter who was talking about the forest monitoring that's being done in the Anacortes Community Forest. Mm-hmm. And I thought that was a super interesting kind of model for how we might monitor forests on Whidbey Island. I don't know that we would be the people to do that, like our organization, but I thought it was really interesting. And that in they've only been doing that monitoring for 6 years, but in that time, they haven't really seen they haven't seen loss. They didn't see the loss that they were expecting. And I mm-hmm. think that was, for me, like what you're talking about, kind of coming out of it and feeling reassured. I also felt reassured by the scientific data that mm-hmm. was presented. I'm not going to be able to cite all the sources, right? Because I didn't write them all down, but they will be available on the Whidbey Climate Action website, all the presentations and some of the videos from that event. But the fact that the program was triggered by anecdotal sightings from community members that, quote, all the trees in the forest were dying. And what they've kind of discovered over time is that it actually might have been a heat dome event that had killed trees during 1 year, 2015, 2016, and that it wasn't it wasn't necessarily endemic. And mm-hmm. I thought that was really cool. And, I think that, as they said, they only have 6 years of data, and it usually takes 10 years to really have, a good data set. But the trends are suggesting that they're not losing a ton of trees, and that, their forests aren't becoming, just like kindling for wildfire. I also found it really reassuring, at least according to the data that was presented by, I think, the South Whidbey Fire Chief, is that we're really in a very low zone for wildfire. Like we have like a 10% risk or something like that, like in our specific region on our island. And that's like not including like all the man-made like all the man-made wildfire things that actually can happen, but that he was like, we experience a lot of brush fire, but not a lot of wildfire. And going through that distinction of like, what is a brush fire versus what is a wildfire? And as you said, all of the programs that exist in order to prepare for individuals to prepare themselves, including the FireWise program, right, which I think is run through the Whidbey Island Conservation District.
Yeah, I did take some notes, and if I may look at them for a moment.
Yeah, totally.
I noted that Colin runs a program that I'm actually going to try and take advantage of around addressing invasives, because in my home we have quite a lot of invasive holly. Colin McAvinci is with the Conservation District. He's a stewardship forester, and he says he both is and runs the FireWise program.
Yeah, exactly.
I so appreciated his energy, because he really had like a generous and enthusiastic spirit of like, we're here because we care about stewarding our natural resources, and we do it better when we do it together. The spirit that I felt he came to the work with. So I also just so appreciated that he is one of the representatives of many conservation districts. There are 3,000 in the United States and 45 in Washington State. And so I reached out to the Conservation District right away after the conference. And I heard back today with some really specific targeted advice about my holly problem, about how to dispose of holly safely. And then also an offer for a one-on-one consultation at no cost if I want to wait on their waiting list, which I'm happy to do because I'm glad there's so much demand.
Yeah, that's really cool. And I think, in addition to all of the different resources that our conservation district offers us, including, some advice on invasive species in the context of wildfire, I don't remember which presenter it was, but they were talking about how invasive species ends up being can be more flammable than native species, and that in the context of wildfire and wildfire resilience and prevention, that managing invasive species on your property or in your community can help, create greater wildfire resilience.
Absolutely. Yeah. Scotch broom is one of those species that's such a great example of they are what's called a pioneer species, because they can come into a ravaged area and make a home for themselves, because they are a legume and they fix nitrogen. They can make their way in space that's pretty inhospitable to a lot of native plants. So they're often the first to crop up after a clear cut, but they are like tinder, and they happen to frequently line roadways. We actually heard from somebody in Island County, our district commissioner, Melanie Bacon, who said the reason we see so much Scotch broom on the highway is that is Department of Transportation jurisdiction. And so Washington State is responsible for managing weeds along that stretch of road. Island County is responsible for managing weeds along many of our other roads. And the management of noxious and invasive weeds is imperfect and inadequate. But there's also a question around which jurisdiction holds responsibility. I really feel like the Conservation District does a great job of offering support to private landowners, but it's not an enforcement organization, and they can't demand that a property owner take action. They can just offer resources and advice for those property owners that do wish to take action. A couple other things that you mentioned that I just wanted to touch back on. You shared how you had missed the first presenter due to your car battery, which I was so sorry that you weren't able to come, but I wanted to mention the name of the keynote presenter. His name is Guy Gifford. He's our Washington State DNR Director of Community Resilience, I believe. And he's both a wildlands firefighter and a forester. And he was really clear about being a person who loves trees. So I think so often people think the best way to protect their home is to cut all the trees down and move everything tree related as far from the house as possible. But he really spoke about, creating these zones of protection, the very closest in, 5 feet out, 5 to 30 feet, you want to make certain landscaping decisions. From, 30 to 100 feet, I believe. I'm sorry, 30 to 50 feet, you want to make different decisions. And then 50 to 100, you want to make different decisions. So you're protecting your house by thinking about what flammable material is in proximity. How do you clear out brush and create defensible space? But nowhere in that recommendation is there the suggestion that removing trees is the antidote to fires. And really, a mature and healthy forest is one of the most fire resilient things there is. When we deal with invasive species growing up after clear cut, we have a much more dangerous fire condition.
Yeah, that was interesting. That reminds me of, thanks for sharing that and giving a recap. I also thought it was interesting during the end when everybody was doing their panel that anytime somebody came up to ask a question of how far away from their house they should keep something, he was just like 30 feet. Like wood pile 30 feet, propane tank 30 feet, like anything that's potentially flammable, 30 feet.
Yeah. And, every presenter, or I should say many of the presenters spoke about that. I know Colin elaborated on that as well. They also, many of them spoke about being in a wildland urban interface, what they call a WUI. And when you're talking about Eastern Washington, you may have a community that is in that wildland urban interface. They're at the edge of the town, and behind them is, tens or hundreds of thousands of acres of national forest land, for example. Here on Whidbey Climate Islands, we don't have those tens of thousands of acres of community forest land or national forest. What we have is communities that are almost entirely made up of wildland urban interface. My home is adjacent to forested land, as I believe is the case for almost every community member here, with very limited exceptions, like, in the densest part of our urban growth areas or adjacent to the naval base. We're really all living up against the forest. And so when we're talking about structures that are in or near these active timber or agricultural lands, we just have to make good decisions about building. So build resilient structures using less flammable materials. Metal roofing is wise. Non-flammable siding is wise. And I think it was meaningful for me to hear just how much a homeowner or a renter can do to make their own home safer from fire damage.
Yeah, I thought that was really interesting, like to tie the wildland urban interface that we have to the presenter, Jenny, who zoomed in from Maui to kind of talk about the Lahaina fires and the fires in Maui and kind of, all of the ways in which, from her point of view, that the philosophy of permaculture could be used to create greater, wildfire resilience. And even though our climate is different and our circumstances are different than any island in Hawaii, I think I thought it was super interesting to think about like how you can create, fire resistant hedgerows, as boundaries, and that like really taking care of and maintaining the watershed is a very helpful way within community and within ecosystem to create, wildfire resilience. And I thought so much of what she shared was interesting from that viewpoint, being like, how can, really thoughtful landscaping and, planting contribute to that, and how can really thoughtful water management contribute to that? Yeah,
I too felt like Jenny Appel's presentation was probably the most moving and exciting part of the conference for me.
Mm-hmm.
I was moved almost to tears. I also was moved to great excitement. At points of her presentation, I had goosebumps thinking about what was possible.
Mm-hmm.
And she really painted a picture for me of what community resilience looks like when we can be adaptive and nimble and use our ingenuity to come up with solutions that we know we will need in or after a disaster. But how exciting is it to come up with those solutions before the disaster so that we are already, well invested in the ways of living that will protect us, rather than waiting for FEMA to give us what we need after everything collapses. And, she spoke about making presentations to various jurisdictions and making really great suggestions rooted in science and rooted in really clear measurable results from projects that had worked, and hearing again and again, just, oh, thank you, that was very interesting, and seeing a complete and total lack of follow through to actually invest in those solutions that had been presented. And it made me feel excited about her proposal, which was really around, think about permaculture projects that address a need in your community. Find experts who already know how to implement that kind of natural technology. Find a person who is an expert in native plant gardening, a person who is an expert in growing those plants that are going to do better here in 5 or 10 years, as the climate model predicts, with warming and drying and changing of weather patterns. Find people who can create resilient watersheds and restore the conditions for our streams and creeks and lakes to be healthier and more resilient. And then actually have some private public partnerships to invest in basically making those experiments into learning laboratories for others.
Yes.
And, diversify your investment in these great nature-based solutions so that you don't have the clear cut that's teeming with Scotch broom that lights a fire that overtakes the island. Instead, you have the food forest that is climate resilient and is holding topsoil and is fire resistant. So I just felt so excited about the picture she painted for me of what was possible through those small scale, reproducible, nature-based projects.
Yeah, I was also very inspired by her mentioning those projects related to agroforestry, and it reminded me of Jake Stewart and his farm and a lot of the projects that he's doing, because a lot of the things that she mentioned, I had just experienced at Sweetwater Farm a couple of days prior. And so it made me very excited to interview him on this podcast about a lot of the things he's doing, because he is planting forward, in terms of like our zone, our temperate zone. And he is doing, is hopefully starting up a biochar project, which was another thing she mentioned in terms of like creating. So I'm excited to like ask him from that point of view of climate resilience, but how it's interesting to me how climate resilience and wildfire resilience are intertwined. And so is ecosystem resilience, right? Like a lot of the things we're talking about that would help us be better equipped for wildfire in the natural landscape also creates habitat for animals and, is good for all, right? Like it's like an overall health of our ecosystems as a result.
Yeah, absolutely. One thing Jenny said, I liked it so much that I actually quoted her in my journal. I wrote down her exact words. She was talking about how FEMA helps after the disaster, and they don't help very swiftly, and that counties are really here to help us get ready before the disaster. Yep. So she spoke about ways that county can take that action, like increasing watershed buffers. In her case, she thought mandating cover cropping would be responsible because of the toxic runoff that's killing the reef from, tilled soil. He said, this is the quote, "If I were in local leadership, my job is to get our community ready for these disasters. Right now, we have to be proactive." And then she went on to talk about figuring out passive water harvesting strategies. But it ties so closely into the establishment of a critical drainage area. We have a community member, Bill Poss, who's made a very sound policy presentation and proposal about what it would be to make more responsible drainage plans for every project on Whidbey and Camino Islands, because we are a sole source aquifer, and every raindrop that falls on these islands is going either back into the aquifer or off into the sound as runoff. And so just thinking about water as that precious resource that we need to hold on to, that we need to retain, and that we need to cherish, really tied into Jenny's story about what wildfire preparation and resilience looks like.
Yeah, it really did. I think that, that framing of FEMA only being there after the disaster and our county really being responsible for preparing us for those disasters, I think is really critical. And I think that, the critical drainage, what was it? It was like a not a mandate,
So my take on the proposal that Bill Pross.
Yeah. What form was it in?
To me, it read as a policy change that would basically require everyone doing a building and clearing project on these islands to have a drainage plan. And so what I asked our commissioners for was to, and I believe others, including members of Whidbey Climate Action, are asking for the same thing, is to designate the entire county as a critical drainage area.
Right. Yes.
Which complements our pre-existing designation as a critical, a sole source aquifer. Mm-hmm. We only have a sole source aquifer, and it's under our feet, and every raindrop that falls can either go into it or not. Then the whole area is critical to the recharge of that aquifer. Mm-hmm. And therefore, in my opinion, and in the opinion of others, the whole county should be a critical drainage area subject to plans. So when you're in a critical drainage area and you want to get a building permit, you have to say, what happens to that rainfall when it falls on the roof of my home or when it falls on my gravel driveway, when it's not being introduced into a natural system? What happens to it? And what is my drainage plan to make sure that it doesn't become toxic runoff, running mm-hmm. onto my neighbor's property, running down the street, running into the stormwater drain? And so it's really just asking the county to hold everyone accountable to plan for where drainage goes, as opposed to only the biggest projects, which is the current status of the law.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Thanks for that clarification. And as it pertains to wildfire resilience, soil that's holding more water is more resilient. Right? Like if our, the drier we are, not only is that really problematic for all of it's really problematic for all plant life and animal life and human life. And it makes us more susceptible to wildfire.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. And I think several of the speakers spoke about that, the sponge-like behavior of soil, where when it's full, it's also it's absorbent. When it's moist, it's absorbent. And when it's very dry, it hardens and basically just creates runoff and topsoil loss conditions during a heavy rain event. Mm-hmm. And actually, just recently, Washington State Route 20 was closed for some time to clean up mud from the roadway because they were fighting fires. They were fighting fires with water. They were fighting fires with water on dry, disturbed topsoil. Mm-hmm. And a lot of that topsoil just ran down into the roadway. And so I can just imagine big swaths of Whidbey Island washing into the sea in the event that we were fighting a wildfire here. Mm-hmm. And even though we talk about Whidbey and Camino Islands as being pretty fire safe, statistically compared to other parts of the state, the risks are growing. We had the heat event in 2021 that was statistically atypical. We had the hottest day on record this year. I believe it was July 24th, hottest day ever recorded.
Wow.
And we also have changing land use and changing forest health, not always for the better. Mm-hmm. So even though wildfire hasn't come here, and there are a lot of reassuring points of data, including the data out of Anacortes showing that forest health is actually holding steady. I think we shouldn't be complacent about being wildfire ready. And I feel this excitement, but also a sense of urgency around taking a proactive approach to resilience, not thinking, what do we need to do to be ready to recover from the disaster? But what do we need to do to be ready to create the safety? And so creating the safety means, how do we support our community's water infrastructure so that we always have enough? How do we support our community's forest health so that we always have a rich, biodiverse understory? I'm really much more excited about talking, how do we mitigate the risk of disaster by becoming as healthy and resilient and diverse and interdependent as possible? And then if disaster happens, we already have the skills and the resources and the ecosystem services present to bounce back. I'm much less interested in talking about, how do we stockpile some sense of safety to be able to respond eventually when the worst thing happens. And one thing I really appreciated about the diversity of panelists and speakers was a lot of them were talking about how to make healthier conditions now. Not talking about where's the Red Cross shelter going to be after the fire? Where's the evacuation route going to be after the fire? It's really about, what are the smart steps that we can take as homeowners, as farmers, as community members, as jurisdictions today to reduce our chances of the worst thing happening.
Yeah. And ultimately, all of the things that would benefit us in other ways also would help prevent wildfire. It is all tied together. It is all integrated and focusing on the health of our aquifer and the health of our soil and the health of our forests and the health of our native plant communities is the protection that will help us be more wildfire resistant to start with, right? Because that's the thing that, from a environmental standpoint, a natural landscape standpoint, that those are the things that can be helpful. Another part of it that I thought was interesting, or like two takeaways that I had about like infrastructure and policy things that could help us, be more prepared and maybe like mitigate the potential of wildfire is putting our, power lines underground. That, which also is great for windstorms knock our power out all the time in the winter and create all kinds of hazards that could or could not be related to wildfire. But in Maui, that was part of what, sparked the wildfire to begin with. There was that their power lines were not underground. And, and I don't know how feasible that is, but it's like one of those infrastructure things that would help us be resilient in that way. And then the other thing, one of the presenters was from Safe and Humane Fireworks in Island County, and was talking about, fireworks use, legal and illegal fireworks use in Island County and how that impacts fires, and there was some data that was given, by the presenter in Washington State about the number of fires that are potentially started by fireworks. And it's quite a lot. It's not a small number, to be like, oh, like on the 4th of July, there's potentially a lot more fires that are started than the rest of the year. Whether or not, there are more fires during the summer months anyway, just because there's, it's more of a drought and there's greater fire risk. So there's some questions about like whether or not it's related to the summer or July 4th, but anecdotally, we know that there are a lot of fireworks going off and that fireworks can start fires.
Right. Yeah, something that I appreciated from Jackie Lassiter's presentation about fireworks and the risks that they pose was just about how so many of our surrounding counties have already identified that home firework displays are less safe than municipal shows, and they've already made home fireworks use illegal. Mm-hmm. And for that reason, we end up getting a lot of fireworks tourism. So people are coming to Whidbey Island and Camano Island because Island County doesn't have a ban on these home fireworks shows. And then we're getting really unlawful action. We're getting people blowing up airborne firework explosives that are already illegal, but we don't have any enforcement because, the problem is so big that we don't have the staff. The sheriff doesn't have the staff to drive around and give a ticket to everybody who's doing it. And I remember, until recently, I lived in Skagit Head, which is a pretty densely developed area. And, from dusk on the 2nd or 3rd of July through middle of the night on the 5th or 6th, we'll often have people blowing up fireworks that go up into the sky and explode. And that's clearly illegal. But, we can be one of many hundreds of people calling the sheriff's department that night to report this illegal activity. But the chances that my neighbor is actually going to be cited and given a ticket for that activity is so extremely low. I've never heard of it happening. Mm-hmm. And it just sort of, in my opinion, it makes the community lose faith in law enforcement to do their job if nobody is ever held accountable for doing an unlawful action.
Yeah, which, speaks to the larger questions around enforcement on a county level in general, whether it's law enforcement or, code enforcement, or there isn't a lot of enforcement across the board. Right. Seems. Yeah.
Right. And I also think that there are different perspectives on, the role of various jurisdictions and agencies, whether they are or should be enforcement agencies. And, the value between mandates versus incentives versus disincentives, what is the best way to promote right action? And, I think it varies. There are a lot of different approaches, but one of the things that I really appreciated about this conference was that so many of the presenters did work in the public sector. Mm-hmm. So many of them are employed by state or local jurisdictions to do work to make all of us safer one way or the other. And I really got a feeling for the goodwill of many people who work in government to do the right thing. Mm-hmm. And that can be confidence building, because I think so often when we are change makers, when we're called by some value or some sense of mission to try to make the world a better place, that we can become really dispirited when we see the gap between where we are and where we think we need to be. Mm-hmm. But I found it heartening to see the number of good, smart, dedicated people who were doing work informed by science for the public good and doing it with a real spirit of generosity.
Yeah, I agree. We haven't mentioned Eric Brooks in Island County Emergency Response yet, but I thought that he also, like Colin at the Whidbey Conservation District, is the entire department. Which, but I thought he also gave a really good presentation about what to do when evacuation is necessary, right? And really, he also gave that really helpful kind of framing that if you have a real emergency that is related to, I guess any kind of emergency response that's, I guess, natural. I don't know if it's only natural disaster related, but that if you call 911 and ask for him, it goes directly to his duty phone, and he's like directly patched through for people who are experiencing real emergency, like require real emergency response. Like if you're, experiencing extreme flooding in your home and you need to be taken out by boat or something like that, he, in addition to the police and fire department, would be the person at the county who would be able to help you with that. Yeah.
Yeah, so much of what we heard really related not just to wildfire, but to other natural or man-made disasters. Yeah. And I thought about that when I was thinking he spoke to a community member who was worried about tidal inundation during a storm surge event, in a beach community. And he offered that, if you actually need to be evacuated, like if you are being threatened, if your safety is at risk because of this event, we will absolutely get to you and get you out. If evacuation for your safety is necessary, we will get to you regardless of whether it's a private or a public roadway. That this is why emergency responders are here to serve. They're here to protect us and to get us out when we're threatened. So that was reassuring. It also just had me thinking about, the kind of resilience that comes from being foresightful about what might come to pass as a natural disaster, but the human conditions that we sustain or create will change the impact of that disaster. And so it just had me thinking about, what is adaptive resettlement, proactive relocation away from vulnerable shoreline areas that are likely to be inundated versus there's the term managed retreat, but retreat sounds like giving up. And really, we're going not away from what's wrong, but towards what's coming. Towards what's coming is a resilient community that is not inundated by tidal waters. And we can either invest in that now and start creating that now, or pay for the cleanup and the disasters and the threats to lives and homes that come from failing to do that preparedness work.
Yeah, that's really helpful. It reminds me, I think maybe it was in his presentation or someone else's, but talking about how one of the things you can do is retrofit your home for wildfire. And I think maybe when it comes to sea level rise and, coastal communities, maybe retrofitting communities for sea level rise is part of it, to be like, what does that look like? Does it mean you have to put your house on stilts? Does it mean you have to move it? But the adaptability of the community and the structures is,
right. Yeah. And sometimes that rebuilding is expensive, but it also may be a way to protect an investment and to protect safety and prevent a costly and dangerous calamity. So, when I think about something Jenny Pell shared was just how much the fuel and the pesticides and the herbicides that get stored in people's garages, in a fire, those things all go up and become aerosolized. And suddenly we're breathing these petrochemicals, and they're falling down on our topsoil, and they're washing down into the stream and then into the sea, and they're killing the wildlife. And we have an incredibly biodiverse nearshore marine ecosystem.
Yes.
I don't know if you've seen the documentary. I think it's called Beneath the Salish Sea. It was made several decades ago, but it's just an incredible documentary, kind of in the style of what you might think of being like a Jacques Cousteau movie, where there's a narrator with a fabulous accent who's talking about the incredible biodiversity that lives right off our shores. And my home is over near Fox Spit and Baby Island. And the documentary was mostly made right off Baby Island. So I'm right now physically probably only a mile or two or maybe 3 from where this documentary was filmed. And it's just incredible how rich and biodiverse that space was a couple decades ago. And it's already changed for the worse. Fish populations have plummeted. The health of that nearshore marine ecosystem has plummeted. And I just think about the incredible loss of biodiversity and sea life that could happen if all the garages with all the fuels and chemicals and yard care products got flooded and all those chemicals entered the waterway. We could be in for a really big problem, whether that comes because of fire or whether that comes because of sea level rise and tidal inundation. It's just a ticking. I don't even like the word bomb. It's such a violent word, but it's an egg ready to hatch.
Yeah. I think that's a really, how we interact with, everything's connected, right? everything we use in our lives is connected. And you're right. We wouldn't, people store that stuff away and away from their children and away from their pets and away from, human life or any living thing that they care about because it's toxic, right? Whatever these materials might be. And it is really helpful to consider like what would happen if they were to be chemically altered or dispersed by, a natural disaster. To shift it though, there are, human beings can use fire to increase biodiversity, because Pamela Sea Monster told us a story about the relationship between the Coast Salish people and fire, and using fire in the forests, burning in an S shape in the forests to help the health of the understory, and how, utilizing fire in a controlled way can be a really great way to enrich the soil of the forest floor or of a prairie, right? Like at Pacific Rim Institute and other sites on Whidbey Island, controlled burns are used to help generate greater biodiversity in the landscape. And so I really appreciated her talking about Thunderbird, which I don't know that much about Thunderbird. I don't know if you do. Maybe you might know more than me.
I think Pamela Sea Monster is such a leader in our community. It's such a bright spot in terms of her sharing of stories, her sharing of tribal wisdom, her generosity of just her character. She's just such an incredible force. Mm-hmm. She shared, as you said, about the historic relationship between the Coast Salish people and fire. But really, what struck me most about her story was that she opened by talking about how everyone thought they were people,
Yes, I loved that. Mm-hmm.
She said, the four-leggeds thought they were people, and plants thought they were people.
Mm-hmm. The berry people. Yeah.
The creatures thought they were people, and the humans thought they were people too. Mm-hmm. And later on, she asked us the question, she was questioning whether the humans had been good communicators. And she was raising that perhaps the humans had not been good communicators. Perhaps they were not talking
to the people.
Perhaps communication had broken down. And so she asked a question, are we talking to all the people? Mm-hmm. Or do you think we are the only people?
Yes.
And that was such an apt question. And, she really spoke to the values of respect and wisdom and generosity and courage. And that if we can talk to all the people and not only the human ones, and if we can do it centered in these values of respect and courage, wisdom and generosity, that we actually could, be in great balance with all of creation. Mm-hmm. And, she raised this question about how we can re-indigenize our environment. Mm-hmm. And I think some people use that term, to indigenize appropriatively, like can the power holders in our system somehow have that knowledge? Can we, obtain that tribal way and then use it in our system? And I think that she was speaking about something really different. That was, can we bring back this value of communicating with all the people, not just the human ones? Can we bring back this value of moving with respect with each other? And she spoke about canoe culture and, pushing forward together, pulling together. And boy, I just think if anyone ever has an opportunity to spend time with Pamela Sea Monster, just jump at it, because she's brilliant and she's generous with her time and energy. Yeah,
I really was moved by her story of all the people and really showing the ways in which we have disconnected ourselves as human beings from all the people, and, as you said, have stopped communicating. The quote from her that I took and a quote from Jenny that I took, I think are actually maybe interrelated, but Pamela said, quote, "Everyone has a sacred promise. We have to get better at keeping promises." Mm-hmm. And when Jenny was kind of rounding out her speech and people were asking, like what the solution is local government has to answer to their citizenry. She's like, answer to your citizenry is what she said. And to me, that really connects to getting better at keeping promises, right? It's like we're actually all accountable to each other. And by each other, that's all the people, includes
absolutely
the non-human people. You know,
that's such a great connection.
Yeah.
Yeah.
On my notes next to each other. So it's helpful, but yeah, I thought it was a really great conference.
It really was. And, you know, there were a couple of points where I took little to-do lists from the presentations, and I'd like to share those now because I think they're actually applicable beyond just the topic of each presentation.
Yeah, sounds good.
Eric Shen's presentation on the Anacortes Community Forest Lands Forest Monitoring Project, you know, he spoke about what it would take to grow and sustain this work. And the four things that he pointed out really feel like the four things that we need to do to grow and sustain our work as Whidbey Environmental Action Network, or at least four of the many things. And they were to build longer term partnerships.
Yep.
To share the data with collaborators.
Yep.
To grow deeper and broader financial support for the project. And to staff up so that they can analyze the data and make sense of it. And those just feel like four really solid next steps for a program like that. And, you know, anyone trying to do environmental advocacy rooted in science. And I just so appreciated that clear set of next steps. And I feel like we can learn something from them.
I agree. The other thing that he mentioned that I thought was key, and I think will be key for us, is that that project has a really solid lead scientist in Dave Peterson. And I think that having, in terms of when we're building relationships with really wonderful scientists, I think will be something that we will want to do too.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes, I agree completely. I also wanted to just share a list that I made while listening to Jenny Pell, because she was talking about how local jurisdictions can better support adaptability and good solutions at a scalable pre-disaster point, so that FEMA doesn't have to come in and save us after the disaster, or so that we are more resilient and less likely to suffer greatly in a disaster. As I said, some of the steps that a jurisdiction can take are to define goals, to identify private projects that steer towards those goals, to invest in them and not let them fail, and then to nurture local knowledge holders. And then that can be reproducible. And she spoke about, you know, it's pretty hard to get from growing 0% of your food to growing 5% of your food in your backyard or in your neighborhood or in your community. But if you have the local knowledge holders and the garden beds and the practices and seeds, then it's actually pretty easy to grow from 5% to 20%. He's talking about investing in those projects that get us all towards that 5%, because then it's pretty easy to grow.
Those are great lists. Do you have any more? Or those two?
Well, you know, the other thing I wanted to mention was just how cool it is that we have Nicholas Walsh as our fire chief in Island County. You know, I have a lot of lists. I can share more. But one thing I really appreciated about Nicholas coming on and sharing is that, you know, as a first responder, he's about saving homes, saving lives. And he presented around how our local volunteer fire crews are being trained up for wildfire response.
Yeah.
And when he shared those images of our folks going to the Leavenworth Firefighter Challenge, I was impressed just seeing our folks, you know, kitted out in their full firefighting outfits up in the mountains. And then he told me that they were running 10Ks in those get-ups. And my oldest daughter is a volunteer firefighter, and she's in paramedic school. And I just think about, I know how heavy her uniform is. She's told me about it. And she's told me about how physically strenuous it is to do firefighting work in that uniform. And so run a 10K in order to become stronger and better able to fight fires for us here at home, especially as a volunteer. I think that that's so commendable. And I want to say thank you to both the paid and the volunteer fire staff who work to keep us safe.
Yeah, that was awesome. That was a great presentation. I really liked also, it was really cool to see that they call it red carding, right? Like people being certified.
Getting certified at a certain level as wildfire firefighters.
Yeah. And then using brush fire as training. So even though it was he showed that one picture of a bunch of firefighters responding to a brush fire, but using the techniques that they had learned in wildfire training to sequester the fire. And I thought that was really cool.
Yeah, that was cool. Mm-hmm. Yeah, we got so many great gifts from the presenters at this conference. You asked about lists, and another list I'd like to share is Eric Brooks, who's the director of the Department of Emergency Management for Island County. Mm-hmm. He reminded us about the P's of prepping for evacuation.
Oh, yeah.
That was be prepared to care for your people and your pets. Mm-hmm. Be prepared with your papers, your important documentation, maybe your deed, your insurance docs, your passport. Be prepared with your prescriptions, including any medications or eyeglasses you may need. Bring your pictures and your precious memorabilia because you may not be able to go back for them. Mm-hmm. Bring your personal computer and bring your plastic, meaning your ATM or credit card. And if you do carry cash, be prepared with small bills because he reminded us that in an emergency, if you need to buy a bottle of drinking water and all you have is a $20 bill, you might have to spend $20 for that bottle of drinking water. So as you're packing your go bag for any kind of natural disaster, just think about, are the P's close at hand, these 6 P's of people and pets, papers, prescriptions, pictures, personal computer, and plastic. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's a great list. I liked, he gave a list of levels 1, 2, and 3 for when, like the phases of, I guess, like when there is an event, it starts at level 1 and then goes through level 3. Level 1 is be ready, be prepared to evacuate, stay informed, sign up for emergency alerts, check local emergency service websites, social media, TV and news, have your emergency plan and go kit of supplies ready, act early. If you or your loved ones can't move quickly, consider moving pets and livestock. Mm-hmm. And then level 2 is be set to evacuate at a moment's notice, significant danger in the area. Follow your emergency plan and grab your go kit of supplies. Check news and radio for updates. Inform loved ones of your evacuation plans. And conditions can change rapidly. Leave if you feel unsafe. He did also in this whole explanation of the different levels. He mentioned multiple times that if you have anyone in your party who will move slower or needs assistance, that leaving early is always better. Right. Do not wait. He also mentioned, and I don't remember where this was, and I don't know if you made a note of it, that if you are a person who requires any kind of life-saving machinery, that you can be registered for a list. I think it's with PSE, or so that you're like, if our power goes out, that you can be prioritized.
Right. Yeah. He was sharing that information in the context of sometimes the Puget Sound Energy Company will do a planned power outage during a weather event where there is a high risk of fire.
Right. Where they pre-shut off the power.
If there's a windstorm during a heat dome event, for instance, it may be clear that downed power lines would spark a fire, and therefore they might strategically cut power during that event. But by becoming registered as a person who might use, for instance, a powered life-saving medical device, you can get priority action from PSE to turn you back on prior to some other customers whose need might be less sensitive. Mm-hmm.
And then level 3 is go now, leave immediately, extreme danger in the area, leave without delay. It's unsafe to stay. Do not stop to gather belongings or protect your home. Emergency services may not be available to help you if you choose to stay. Do not return until officials announce the area is safe. So those are the 3 levels that that he shared with us too.
In my case, that would mean figuring out how to evacuate my mule, make a plan at level 1 to borrow a horse trailer, have my horse trailer on site at level 1, because, if it's a level 3 evacuation order, I can easily throw my dogs and cat in the car, but I can't just throw my mule into the trailer unless the trailer is on site and hitched up.
Yeah. And that is really, that's really like a consideration of the logistics, like the additional logistics. And that would be a part of your evacuation plan, which I think he was also suggesting that we all have one that's written down.
Yeah, he really spoke to how important it is for families with children to have a plan around where's our close-in meeting spot, after an emergency, where in the yard do we reconvene, or where in the neighborhood do we reconvene, but also have a far away meeting spot. Like, let's say our neighborhood becomes uninhabitable and we are evacuated to somewhere far away. Is there a friend who lives in an entirely different part of town where we can say that's where we reconnect?
Mm-hmm. Any more lists? Any closing lists, Marnie?
This is a really compelling closing list. This is just the 8 projects that the ACFL Forest Monitoring Project is doing. And I love these 8 projects because they tie into citizen science, which I think is such a growing edge for us and such an opportunity.
Yeah.
They are doing plot studies, which is about, monitoring the well-being of a certain plot of forest. They're doing the cedar mortality survey, which you already shared is yielding some surprising and encouraging outcomes. The data seems to point to the fact that the cedars are actually okay.
Yep.
They're doing phenology studies, which my understanding of what that is limited, and I'd like to learn more. But I really think it's about how the plants are doing, how they're growing, what their life cycle is like, whether their significant life events are happening earlier in the season due to climate change, for instance. They're doing a canopy assessment, which is drone assisted. They're studying fire effects and recovery. And in that, they're learning that biodiversity is actually significantly greater in the area that burned than in the area. And so they're seeing 58 plant species as opposed to 11 plant species in the area that burned and is recovering. They're studying bird populations. They're studying weather and climate. And finally, they're studying soil moisture. So what more compelling list can I give us to close out than that? That's a pretty good one.
It's comprehensive. It's a comprehensive list. I think the only other thing maybe I'll say is take care of all your people.
Yes.
Have a plan to take care of all your people now.
And to that list of the 6 Ps, can we add perennials? I think we should each pack away a few native seed packets in our go bag.
I think you're right, actually, because that speaks to the seed library was one of the things that Jenny Pell said would be a really helpful thing to have in the event of a disaster, so that you had seeds to use to recover plant life with.
Yeah, replanting a biodiverse native forest after a wildfire can be hard when the seed stock burns.
Yeah, so hopefully it never comes to that.
Hopefully not. But yeah, tuck some seed packets into your go bag and take good care.
Another man up in the pulpit in the state house. Head of the table with a black pen, scratching egos, talking too loud. Externalize every outcome, every warm gun, every profit. Kneeling down to the flashing numbers, the NASDAQ, the cold constructs. Running backwards, so just keep moving, just keep moving, just keep moving. Unlearning every lesson that our mothers tried to teach us.
This podcast is a production of the Whidbey Environmental Action Network and is made possible by our generous donors. Produced, edited, and mixed by me, Amanda Bullis. Special thanks to Marianne and Steve for their years of service through action and for lending their voices to this podcast. To WEEN's Executive Director, Marnie Jackson, and our board for their leadership. Special thanks to Whidbey musician and WEEN board member Nathaniel Talbot for letting us use his track Intuition from the album Animal, available on Bandcamp.
Every day on your paycheck, a volume of confidence against the idea of your body being put into your own hands. So please don't hold it, please don't hold it, please don't hold it back. Unleash the power, the straight logic of compassion. What I need now ain't that old religion or the cold hard facts. Just need a woman's intuition, get us on track. Just need a woman's intuition, get us on track. Stepping out of the shadow of a false man's allegory, slowly erasing that old violence from the story. Recoupling emotion, slow emotion to intelligence, granting the planters, healers, teachers, feelers a new relevance. What I need now ain't that old religion or the cold